Strong Towns, my organization, is a 501c3 nonprofit. Our mission is to support a model of growth that allows America's cities, towns, and neighborhoods to become financially strong and resilient. I'd like to start the conversation by having you take a step way back in history and think about the way that we build places thousands of years ago. These are two artist renderings. The one on the left is an ancient city called Fertile Crescent, one of the oldest civilizations we've ever excavated, like 6000 BC. The one on the right is, of course, ancient Rome. When you look at these cities and you look at the way that they're laid out, the way that they're designed, the way that buildings are spaced, the way that different uses are separated from each other, they're all based around a society of people who walked, right? This was the dominant transportation technology of the day, and so it's no shock to us that everything is laid out around people who walked. Fast forward thousands of years to, this is my hometown of Brainerd, Minnesota, in the early 1900s. Many people would arrive by railroad stop, they'd arrive by stagecoach, but when they got to town, everything was arranged again around people who walked. The spacing of the buildings, the style of development, everything was very similar to what you had seen for thousands and thousands of years. Beginning in the early 1900s and accelerating after World War II, we began to build places around the new transportation technology, right? That being, of course, the automobile. We came up with different building styles, different building types, different ways of arranging things on the landscape. If you ask people today to explain this transition, they're likely to talk about it in terms of progress. We used to be a nation, we used to be a people who walked everywhere, so we built cities around people who walked. We're now a people who drive everywhere, and so we build cities around people who drive. Someday we will have jet cars, and we will build cities around people in jet cars. And someday we will teleport, and our cities will look completely different than they do today. This is a narrative of progress, continually getting better. And it's very affirming to us as people to think of this transition in this way. There's another way, though, that isn't quite as affirming, that I want to plant in the back of your head as kind of a backdrop for this entire conversation we're going to have. When we look at these artist renderings here and we ponder these cities, we understand that it took thousands of years of experimentation in city building and civilization creation to get to this point. People tried different things. What worked, they built on. What didn't work, they got rid of. When I say didn't work, I mean people died, civilizations were wiped out. These people refined the knowledge behind doing this by trial and error experimentation. And by the time you get to the early 1900s in my hometown, people had been building in this style for thousands and thousands of years. Knowledge and wisdom gained the hard way. Trial and error experimentation. When we look at this, there isn't a similar body of knowledge that goes along with this. We didn't test this out in Massachusetts for 100 years to see what worked and then, incrementally build off of that. We just started building in this way, all at once, all at the same time, everywhere. The body of knowledge didn't come from trial and error over a long period of time. It was, theoretical knowledge to try to address specific problems. This seems very normal to us today because this is all most of us alive have ever seen. But it's important to understand that we have been doing this for a very short period of time. This is a very young experiment. A social experiment, a cultural experiment, a political experiment, and a financial experiment. Today, I'm going to talk to you about some of the financial implications of this approach to building that weren't apparent to our ancestors, a couple generations ago when we started to build in this pattern. When we look today at how we create growth and jobs and economic development, there's really three main financial mechanisms that we use. The first is transfer payments between governments. This is the idea that the state and the federal government, as our partners in creating jobs and growth, provide grants, provide loans, provide different subsidies to enable us to grow. The second is transportation spending. The idea that our collective gas tax dollars, supplemented by additional funds, would be used to make transportation improvements. Those transportation improvements create an inducement and a platform for growth. The third is debt. The idea that we can access large amounts of capital, take on mortgages, commercial real estate loans, have those sold off on a secondary market, securitized, bought up by pension funds around the world. These financial mechanisms are used at the local level to create growth, and of course, the growth is good because it increases our tax revenue. This is kind of city management 101. There's some really powerful incentives at play here, and it's important that we understand them. When we get new growth through one of these mechanisms, the cost that we as local taxpayers pay as part of that transaction is very nominal. Most of the cost is paid by the state, the federal government, paid by the DOT, paid by the individuals that come in and take those mortgages on or the commercial real estate loans on. We may have a small local match, we may have a little upsizing, we may have some staff time, but the bulk of the investment is being made by others. The benefit that we get as local taxpayers immediately, however, is substantial. We have very little money invested, but now we have all this new tax revenue coming in, and as a city, we're doing pretty well. The catch is that as part of these transactions, we agree that we will service and maintain all this stuff forever. We will fix all the pipes and the pumps and the valves, the meters, the road, the streets, the manholes, all that becomes our long-term responsibility. We are, in a sense, exchanging a near-term benefit in cash for a long-term obligation. There's only one of two ways that this strategy makes sense. Either growth is going to continue at ever-accelerating rates. In other words, we're always going to be able to bring in that much more growth. It's going to create that much more revenue. We can use that revenue to make good on all the promises we've made in prior generations. Or the pattern of development, the way we actually go about building our places, is going to generate for us more wealth and revenue and prosperity than it generates long-term in costs. Now, I think everybody understands that the first one is not true. It's not mathematically possible, but even if it were, we've lived through enough of this where we've seen that we're not going to grow exponentially at accelerating rates forever. Unfortunately, the second one is also not true, and this is where, for a brief bit of time, this presentation will get a little bit technical. I am an engineer. I have to do a little bit of this. I'll walk you through it so it won't be too painful. One of the things that we've done at Strong Towns is to go out and actually delve into and try to understand what is going on in different segments of our development pattern. And specifically, we've looked for areas where we can eliminate as much of the white noise as possible, as much as the background complexity as possible, and focus on the real numbers that are going on. This is probably the simplest development you'll ever see. This is a dead-end road with a cul-de-sac. These are 2.5 acre lots. The only infrastructure here is a road. There's no through traffic, there's no commercial traffic. The only people that use it are the people that live along it. It was built in the mid-1990s. When it was built, it was a gravel road. The city wanted it paved. The city went out and paved it and paid half the cost. They asked the property owners to pay the other half. We asked the question, all right, based on the taxes the city is receiving from the property owners along this road, the only people that really use it in any substantive way, how long is it going to take the city to recoup what they just spent to build it? Their half. The answer is 37 years. Now, the road isn't going to last 37 years, but it's going to take the city that long just to recoup what it cost to initially build it. To maintain it is going to be someone else's problem. This is a slightly more intense development. These are half-acre, three-quarter-acre lots. The one on the west here are a little bit bigger, but you can see they have a minimal amount of frontage. Again, this is a closed-loop system, dead-end cul-de-sac. There's no through traffic. There's no commercial traffic. The only people utilizing this road are the people that live in this development. This was built in the early 1980s. It completely fallen apart. The city went out and fixed the road. The cost was $354,000. We asked the question, all right, based on the taxes the city's collecting from the people that live within this development, how long is it going to take them to recoup that money? The answer is 79 years. We all understand the road's not going to last anywhere near that long. So we asked the question, all right, if the city were going to try to recoup from these property owners enough money between now and the time the road falls apart again to actually pay to fix the road. What would that mean? It would mean an immediate 46% increase in taxes, and annual increases of 3% over inflation every year for the next 25 years, with all that money going just to maintain the road. Now, sometimes people say, okay, Chuck, we get it, we understand. We know we lose money on residential property, we make it up on commercial. Commercial's our cash cow. To which my initial response is always, all right, I don't know any corporations that lose money on 90% of what they do and try to make it up on the last 10%. I don't know why an incorporated municipality would think that was a good strategy. Nonetheless, we've culturally developed this notion that if we just get enough commercial property, we don't have to care about what happens with the residential. This is a business park. This is a kind of build it and they will come investments that cities, of this size do all the time. This one was built in the mid-1990s. It's got the wide industrial streets, the curb and gutter, the sewer, water, everything. This is completely built out now today. Every single lot has been developed. And the city wants to build phase 2, the exact same thing on property they own right next door. They're just gonna take this and mirror it and literally build the same thing. We said, all right, if we could build the same thing at the same cost and get the same level of investment, would that be a good deal for us? The cost in today's dollars would be $2.1 million. We can look and see exactly what has been built out there. There's $6.6 million of investment. Now, pause for a second. Of that investment, 4 of those lots are a church. I go to church. Churches are a very important part of our communities, but the church isn't paying any taxes to the city. 2 of the lots belong to the school district. I went to public schools. My kids go to public schools. Schools are a very important part of the community, but the school district is not paying any taxes on their bus maintenance facility. One of the lots is a county maintenance garage. One of the lots is a city maintenance garage. Of the remaining lots, the ones that theoretically are paying taxes, every single one of them was either sold for $1 and or given a long-term tax subsidy in order to attract that business to move into the park. For the sake of our analysis, we assumed that the entire new development would be built out within a year. Every single entity that built would be a full tax-paying, non-subsidized business. And that every single penny of revenue would go to retire that debt. If that were the case, it would still take almost 3 decades, 29 years for the city to break even. That's 29 years where everybody else's taxes would need to go up to pay to plow the snow off the roads, to mow the ditches, provide police protection, fire protection, and every other service that would be needed. And that's in the most wildly optimistic of scenarios. I used to go through and do about a dozen of these case studies. I found that I can make my point in only 3. When you start to get beyond 3, people start crying and banging their heads on and we don't want that. So if you're interested in this, there's a bunch more case studies on our website. I'll give you that address at the end. Let me cut to the chase here. And again, I apologize for being an engineer. I like graphs. If you're not a graph person, I will walk you through this. Let's say that a developer comes to town, says, I own a piece of property out here I would like to build on. I'm willing to build all the homes. I'm willing to build all the commercial properties. I will put in the roads and the streets and the curb and the sidewalk. I'll put in the pipes and the pumps and the valves and the meters. I'm not asking for any subsidies. I will follow all of your rules. The only thing that I'm asking as a developer is that when I'm done building all this, that you, the city, the public, agree to take over and maintain all the infrastructure I'm building. What would we say? We'd say, fantastic, right? You mean you follow all of our rules? We have to spend nothing. We get all this growth. We get all this new tax revenue. This is the ideal scenario, right? Let's say, though, we had heard of this strong town stuff. We want to be good, prudent, Maine, good Yankees, right? We're going to do things the right way. We're prudent people. So when this revenue starts to come in from this new development, we're going to take the portion that would normally go for maintaining stuff, and we're just going to set that aside. And every year when that revenue comes in, we'll add to what we have, and we'll allow it to accumulate over time. And when we get out a generation from now, and we have to actually make good on that promise, we got a pot of money that we can go and use to fix all this stuff. Here's what that looks like. In year one, everything's brand new. City has spent nothing. The revenue comes in. We take that portion, we set it aside. In year two, we add to what we had in year one. In year three, we add some more. In year four, and you can see year after year after year, we continue to add that little bit of money that comes in. 5-year-old road isn't costing us anything. 10-year-old pipe isn't costing us anything. And by the time we get a couple of decades out, we've got quite a bit of money. The problem is, when we get to year 25, you have to actually make good on that promise we made way back in year one. We find that the revenue cumulatively is insufficient. And from a cash flow standpoint, we run far into the negative. Now, cities aren't one development. Cities are a collection of development, a collection of neighborhoods. Let's say that our developer comes back a couple years later and says, you know, the development works so well for me, it works so well for you. I would like to do a similar sized development. And in fact, every other year from this point forward, a developer walks in the door and does a similar sized development. In other words, this is the ideal scenario for any city. Nice, steady, continuous growth. And we take that money and we set it aside and we allow it to grow so we can make good on the promises that we make when we do those transactions. Here's what that looks like. In year one, your first development comes in, it starts to pay in. In year three, you've got another. In year 5, in year 7. And you can see that, you've got all this growth upon growth upon growth. Your cash actually starts to accelerate upwards. Everything's brand new. Nothing's costing you anything. You're feeling very rich. You go out and build that new community center, or put in that new park, or build a new public works building, whatever it is. You've got all kinds of money coming in. You're feeling very, very rich. And when you get to year 25, the year you have to make good on that first promise you made way back in year one, yeah, you've got to spend a little bit of money, but it's not a big deal, right? It's not a big deal. You've had all this growth. The growth creates what we call the illusion of wealth. Because as we all intuitively understand, if you lose money on every transaction, you don't ultimately make it up in volume. If you lose money on every project that you do, the further you go out into the time horizon, the more downward pressure there is on your budget. This is why we have cities that have done, quote, all the right things for decades, yet find themselves today with no money to fix a sidewalk or fill a pothole or maintain a street. How can that possibly be? The reason is because our development pattern is not financially productive. One more graph, because you can look at this and say, okay, Chuck, I get it. This is really, at the end of the day, from a psychology term, this is called cognitive discounting. It's why people smoke, right? We smoke, it feels good, oh my gosh, we got cancer. But it's a long ways out, right? So we discount it. But you can look and say, well, Chuck, we should have dealt with this a long time ago. How did we get through this? Because this should have happened quite a ways back. And this is our last graph. This is a graph of debt. Everybody in this room understands the conversation we're having at the national level about our federal debt, right? Our federal 20 trillion, right? It's this enormous, enormous sum of money. If you look at this graph here, the growth of our federal debt is this bottom line here, the blue one. The black one is the growth of our GDP. This green line, the one that soars up like that, that's our private sector debt. That's debt that we share. That's home mortgages, commercial real estate loans, auto loans, credit cards, margin interest accounts, student loans, private sector debt. The way we financed the first generation of this new experimental way of building was by using our savings and by reinvesting that illusion of wealth back into creating more growth. When that started to slow down, when that started to buckle, when the cost started to come due, and it started to become more difficult to keep that all going, think mid-70s, early 1980s, what did we do? It took us a while to figure it out, but we eventually shifted from an economy where we had growth based on savings and investment to an economy of growth based on debt accumulation. And growth by debt accumulation became such an important part of our economy that as we crossed over into the third generation of this experiment, we actually allowed it to become predatory. We actually allowed our funding mechanisms to prey on our neighbors. You don't need a down payment. You don't need to show you can make the payments. You don't even need to have a job. We needed the growth so badly that we allowed our financial system to prey on our neighbors. Our ability to continue this experiment, to prolong it by having the private sector take on ever-accelerating levels of debt, simply is not there. Obviously, there's some huge implications to all this. The mechanisms of growth that we become accustomed to in this post-war experiment are failing us. They're going away. The federal government, the state government are vastly overcommitted. They don't have the money to invest in growth in every city that desperately needs it. The DOTs are functionally broke. Your DOT has far more lane miles to maintain than they have revenue stream to maintain them. That is a fact. And there is no likelihood at all that they're going to get the money they need to maintain everything that they're committed to maintaining. The private sector is tapped out. We do not have the ability to continue to take on accelerating levels of debt. For us as cities, as local governments, this means that we're going to be forced to absorb the cost of our own development pattern. If we want that road fixed, we have to pay for it. If we want that pipe repaired, that money is going to come from us. This can't be done in the current pattern of development without some incredibly large tax increases and or some devastatingly large cuts in services. Now, I didn't come here from Minnesota to tell you what you already know and understand, right? We just had an election this week. What is the debate we're having at every level of government, everywhere across this whole country? How big is the tax increase going to be? Who's going to pay for it? How deep is the service cut going to be? And where is it going to be felt? It is critical as we sit here today that we see the third variable in that sentence. The third variable being the current pattern of development. As long as we continue to build in a way that is functionally insolvent, there is no way that our cities are going to avoid becoming insolvent. As long as we continue to build in a way that gives us an illusion of wealth today in exchange for crippling long-term obligations, there's no way that our cities are going to avoid default. Whether that is a hard default, like we see in places like Detroit and Stockton and San Bernardino, or whether it's a soft default, like we see in thousands of cities across this country, where they're putting off maintenance, where they're laying off public safety employees, where they're letting parks go because they simply don't have the money. We have to start having a conversation about how we build more productive places. So what's the solution? And I have to say, I years ago, like 3 years ago, I did a series of lectures across California. And I had to put this slide in because as I would go along, we're going to talk the rest of the time about how we look at things and how we do things differently. I would get to the end and someone would always stand up and say, well, Chuck, I'm really upset because you've come here and told us that everything is going bad and you didn't give us the solution. What is the solution to these problems? And it occurred to me after a number of times getting this question that I was not hearing it correctly. I was hearing, what is the solution? And what they were really asking was something fundamentally different. What they were really asking is, what can someone else change about what they're doing so that I don't have to change anything about what I'm doing? I know of no such solution. We have created for ourselves a very complex set of problems, a complex set of problems that defy a solution or a series of solutions. What we talk about at Strong Towns are rational responses. How do intelligent people roll up their sleeves, have an intelligent conversation at the community level about what do we do rationally about this complex set of problems? When I start talking rational responses, I always go back to this photo here. This again is my hometown. Back in the early 1900s. I lived 2.5 hours north of Minneapolis, St. Paul today. This, back then was the middle of nowhere, right? This was the edge of civilization. Look at this place. Look what they built. I love this street. As a planner, I look at this and I say, look at the great, way they framed the public realm. Look at the way they lined up the buildings. They've got great segmentation of the space. The buildings themselves have great symmetry. They front the public realm in just a beautiful way. This street totally rocks. We would kill to have this street today. Let me ask you a few questions about these people who built this place. How thick was their zoning code? How many boards and committees did you have to go to get an approval to build something here? How much tax subsidies did they give out? How many federal and state grants did they get? How much infrastructure did they build to attract new development? How much tax increment financing did they use? How many planners and engineers and economic development advisors did they have on staff? We can go through the litany of things that we have convinced ourselves are absolutely essential to building great places today. These people had none of them. They didn't even have 30-year mortgages. These were a bunch of illiterate lumberjacks in the middle of nowhere. Look what they built. Look at it. How did they know how to do this? It's really simple. They copied what they knew worked. They took the materials they had on hand and they copied the pattern that they had seen work for thousands of years. Today, with all of our intelligence, all of our expertise, all of our financial resources, our ability to create growth, all the things that we do to make our cities better, this is what this street now looks like. The exact same street from roughly the same place. It's a wasteland of parking lot and half-occupied buildings. If you want to understand in one image why our cities are struggling financially, understand there's $500,000 of public infrastructure invested in those 2 blocks right there. Where's the tax base that's going to maintain that generation after generation after generation? I gave a lecture in Boise, Idaho earlier this year. And when I got to this slide, a student raised their hand, stood up, said, Chuck, I'm from Costa Rica. Costa Rica is a very poor country. We can't afford to build the way that you build here. When we build, we have to build 1 block at a time. And before we can build the next block, we have to make sure that every space is filled in on the block that we just built. We're a very poor country, otherwise we couldn't afford it. We can't afford to build this way. We're a very poor country now too, right? We can't afford to build this way either. And for a long time, that illusion of wealth allowed us to think that things like this didn't matter. That we could walk away from these places, that we could let them go into decline, that we could allow them to devalue, because it didn't matter. We were so wealthy, we had so much affluence, so much prosperity, that we didn't have to bother to think about stuff like this. We're no longer a rich country. We no longer have the money to just throw away. We have to start thinking differently about our places. I want to show you how cities build wealth. Does this street look recognizable to any of you? Do you guys know where this is? This street is Front Street in Brainerd, Minnesota. In 1870, 30 years later, this street would become this street, the exact same street. Look at that, though. That could be Lewiston, right? My guess is you can go back. If you went to the Historical Society here, there's probably a photo that's, way back far enough that was like this, right? Every city that was begun before this whole automobile experiment began just like this. A little pop-up shack. A little row of, hopes and dreams, right? Manhattan started like this. Chicago started like this. Dallas, San Francisco. London, Paris started like this. Rome. These are going to be Romulus and Remus, right? Different building materials. We built thousands of these across this continent for a variety of reasons. Reasons that defy our ability to predict or project or even fully understand after the fact. All those complex variables just didn't come together. A lot of places like this failed. What happens when a place like this fails? Does your pension fund drop by 25%? Does the stock market crash? Do we have to have an emergency session of Congress to bail out banks? No, right? A few people made a little bet, they lost a little bit of money, they'd salvage what they can and they'd move on to the next successful city. For a variety of reasons, reasons that defy our ability to predict or project or even fully understand after the fact. It was the right people in the right place at the right time. All those complex variables just magically came together. A lot of places like this were successful. And when they were successful, they would grow in a very predictable, understandable way that cities have grown for thousands and thousands of years. They would grow incrementally out, incrementally up, and become incrementally more intense. And so, after 30 years of incremental growth, these little shacks were replaced by those 2- and 3-story buildings. And as this city continued to grow incrementally up, incrementally out, and become incrementally more intense, these 2- and 3-story structures would be replaced with buildings of marble, brick, and granite facades. We don't build wealth by going to the casino and putting it all on red. The way we build wealth, and the way cities have always built wealth, is to make small investments over a broad area, over a long period of time. Let me show you how financially productive this style of building and development is. These are 2 identical blocks in my hometown. The one on the left we've labeled old and blighted. The one on the right we've labeled shiny and new. You'll see they're the exact same size, they have the exact same area, the exact same amount of public infrastructure. They're on the exact same highway about the exact same neighborhood. Everything about them is the same except for the style of development. That old and blighted block was labeled blighted by the city. It looks like this today. A pawn shop, a couple of liquor stores, a couple of abandoned buildings, bankruptcy, attorney, one of those old barber shops where you can still get the flat top. This is the most rundown block in the city. The city labeled it as blight. If you think back to those pop-up shacks that I showed you from the 1870s, as this city was incrementally growing out in the 1920s, this was the next increment of out. So this was basically the cheapest commercial building you could build on the edge of town in the 1920s. And what happened after that? Instead of growing incrementally up and more intense, we had the Depression, we had World War II, and then we had a completely different style of development, just skipped right over this. This place has stagnated for 90 years. 2 blocks over, the city also labeled blight. It was very similar to this. Had it torn down, it is now a drive-through taco restaurant. Everybody's thrilled with this transaction. We got rid of blight. We got a brand new shiny building. It meets all the zoning codes. It meets the sign ordinance. It's got plenty of parking. We got the off-street parking gone so the cars can move through more quickly. We put native plants in stormwater areas. We even have a sidewalk put in. The bike advocates wanted that. The sidewalk ends right there, but it goes, this stretch. Here's what nobody bothered to consider. That old and blighted block has a total value of $1.1 million. That shiny and new block, same size area, same amount of public infrastructure, same everything, just a different building style, has a total value of only $800,000. Understand what you're looking at. You're looking at the traditional style of development, the way we built places for thousands and thousands of years, in its infant form, after 90 years of neglect, and it still outperforms by a wide margin this brand new. And we've all been around long enough to understand the trajectory of the taco joint, right? 20 years from now, there'll be a new taco joint up the road. That one will be turned into a used car lot. 10 years after that, it will be boarded up. They'll be selling meth out the back, and they'll be looking for a grant to have it torn down, right? We've all been around long enough to see this happen. In fact, these numbers I ran 2 years ago. This last summer, I was prompted to update this. I want to show you what has happened in the 2 intervening years since we actually did this analysis. That old and blighted block, yeah, it's dropped a little bit in value. But that shiny and new taco joint has lost nearly $200,000. It's lost 23% of its value. We all understand the destination here, right? This is the kind of stuff we've done in our cities. At the same time, we've chased growth out on the edge. And we see a similar kind of thing. This is a Mills Fleet Farm complex in my hometown. This is a double-sized big box store. This is an auto dealership, gas station. This is 20 acres. It's the most valuable 20 acres in the entire area. Downtown Brainerd, this is 20 acres of the core downtown. This is a pretty rundown place. If you've seen the movie Fargo, you've seen a not so flattering but not so inaccurate representation of downtown Brainerd. A lot of boarded up second and third stories, a lot of vacant first stories, meth lab every 6 months or so. In my lifetime, when I was in junior high, those places burned down, they're now a parking lot. When I was in high school, that one burned down, it's now a parking lot. When I was in college, that one burned down, it's now a parking lot. The primary investment in my life has been wait for something to burn down, convert it into a parking lot. Out on the edge of town, we're seeing in that 20 acres a value of $0.6 million per acre. It's the most valuable piece of property in the Brainerd Lakes area. It's huge in terms of the amount of value in that one site. But in the same size land, just a different configuration, we're seeing returns of $1.1 million per acre. We actually get 78% more taxes off of this than we do off of this. Understand what you're looking at. We spent millions and millions of dollars to get this. We spent $100+ million on the bypass. We spent $30 million just to get the sewer out here, tens of millions more to get the water. The city paid for the frontage roads, millions. I actually designed this when I was back doing engineering work about 15, 16 years ago. That was $2.5 million just for that. This is a county road, multiple millions. How much did my generation spend to get this wealth? That was wealth that my great-great-grandparents and their contemporaries built slowly and incrementally over time and bequeathed to us as this great endowment for the community that would continue to pay back and be viable generation after generation after generation. And we have slowly melted. This is a pattern we see in cities big and small, everywhere around this country. This is Buffalo, New York, one of the cities that have been hollowed out by the post-World War II development pattern, right? A city in decline, a city that's not doing well. Yet, when you start to look at the value per acre, can you tell where the downtown is? The traditional part, the part we walked away from? And the interesting thing about this is not simply the fact that it's more, but look how much more it is. Look how far greater that development pattern is. It is so productive. It is so resilient. It produces so much greater returns. There's a reasons why our ancestors built this way. It's not because they were brilliant. It's not because they were greedy. It's not, because they were selfless. The reason they built this way is because they had figured out over thousands and thousands of years that this is how you sustain a place. Through good times, through bad times, through feast, through famine, through war. This is how you build a resilient place. Here's Williamsville, New York. This is population of about 40,000, much smaller place than Buffalo, yet we see the same kind of pattern. Where's their traditional downtown? Where are their traditional neighborhoods? They jump off the screen. Here's a little town by where I live, Crosby, Minnesota, population 1,200 people. Crosby is all proud of the new development they've had out here on the edge, and out here on the edge, These are their rundown neighborhoods that they've labeled blighted, yet look at where all the wealth and the value is. It's in all those rundown, blighted places. The traditional development pattern is amazing financial resiliency. Amazing financial resiliency. Let's talk, just to end up here, how we start to roll back the clock, or not necessarily roll back the clock, but how do we take the knowledge that our ancestors had and apply it to the building form that we've created for ourselves and start to rationally respond to this fundamental insolvency problem that we've created. This is a block in Memphis, Tennessee, called Broad Avenue. Broad Avenue was a former streetcar stop. In the 1950s, they ripped out the streetcars, they put a highway in that split this streetcar stop from the rest of the neighborhood, and this place just died. Vacant commercial buildings, vacant residential up above. Some residents, fed up with the neglect, fed up with the decline, went out, took matters into their own hands. They painted bike lanes, they painted crosswalks, they swept the sidewalks, they swept out the stores, they worked with the landowners to, over the course of a weekend, have a little block party where they brought businesses in temporarily from around town. They had an art gallery, they had a bike shop, they had a clothier, they had an ice cream stand, they had a taco joint, they had all this stuff. They didn't go get Department of Health permits, they didn't get city permission. They said, we're just gonna go out and do this before anybody gets mad, we're gonna be gone anyway. We just wanna show people what this looks like if it's done kind of nice, right? I was out here, not for this event, but I was out here about 6 months after. When I was out here, every single building had a tenant. The second floors were all full too. And the landlord that I talked to said they were able to charge double the amount of rent on the last place to rent than they were asking before this project. When the city went out and started to look at this neighborhood, they found $18 million of new private sector investment that's happened subsequent to this project. They've documented 16 new businesses, over 24 new jobs. What's the public investment here? Nothing. Nothing. What's the return on that investment, right? Enormous. The greatest investments that we can make today is to understand that our ancestors were trying to build in small increments. And in our rush, our obsession with getting all that new growth out on the edge, what we've done is we've overlooked the pennies, the nickels, and the dimes in our neighborhoods that are just sitting there waiting for us to pick them up. These aren't complex things. These are things like put in crosswalks, put in bike lanes like Jeff talked about, plant some trees, trim some trees, fix up, sweep the sidewalk. Basic things that are well within our capacity to do are the high return investments that we find today. I don't know what your city would do. I can tell you what my city would do if we went out and did a project like this. They would be out the next day with the power washers, getting rid of all this stuff. We can't have that. We'd have the city engineer out there saying that doesn't meet our standard plate for what a crosswalk is. You'd have the attorneys saying, well, we could be potentially liable for this. And it would all be gone, right? City of Memphis went out with power washers and got rid of all this too. But they only went out and did that after they had a plan to put it back permanently. You see, the city of Memphis is a little bit desperate. They're desperate, and their desperation has made them really smart, smarter than the average city. What the city of Memphis said is, we could have had all the public hearings in the world. We could have had all the visioning sessions, all the sticker charts on the walls, all the surveys, and we never would have identified this little thing as the high return investment that our city should be making. We would have identified things like convention centers and big road projects, because that's the way those kind of forms are set up to do. We wouldn't have been out doing this kind of thing, but our residents did. And because our residents did, we're never going to let it go back. And in fact, when they went out and painted this, put this stuff in permanently, they said, as long as we're out here with the paint, you know what? Let's try a little experiment of our own. Let's extend this a couple blocks in each direction and see if some of the love that's going on here can ooze into the surrounding neighborhoods. It's a little experiment, a few $100. If it works, let's see what we can get. If it doesn't work, what are we out, right? Starting to think small and incrementally again. It's not in our nature as cities, but it's what we need to do. At Strong Towns, we were inspired by Memphis. We put together a report called Neighborhoods First. You can find this on the homepage of our website. We spent a summer, we spent 6 months working in a neighborhood that was in decline in my hometown. The one right behind that taco joint and that old and blighted block. We had block parties, we had scavenger hunts, we had bike rides throughout the neighborhood. We spent time just out on the street talking to people and observing people. We would take a table and chairs and set up our office out there and just work in a parking spot so we could just see people going by. We saw the mom with the stroller walking through the ditch with weeds up to her waist. Why are you doing that? I don't have a car, I have to get to the grocery store, it doesn't feel safe on the street. We saw the elderly woman with the walker trying to get over the mound of snow. What are you doing? I need to get my prescription from the pharmacy. I don't have a choice, I have to go today. They haven't shoveled the sidewalks, they shoveled the streets first, so there's this big mound of snow I gotta cross. We started to document these things. We observed where people were struggling, and we said, what is the next smallest step we can take to address those struggles? And we came up with this report. 8 little projects. Literally, put a bike lane in over here, put a crosswalk in over here, paint some crosshatching here, trim up some trees here, plant a row of trees in this spot here. Tiny, tiny, tiny little things. My city's in the process right now of doing a $7.2 million project to run sewer and water 1.5 miles out of town to create a new business park at the airport. The money for doing this, $16,700. This is well within our grasp. And if we had this approach throughout every neighborhood, throughout every community in this country, not only would we be making really low-risk, high-return types of investments, but we would be investing in things that are guaranteed to improve people's lives. Now, you're never going to identify these investments in the standard process we use today. The capital improvement plans that we put together, the public hearings that we do, the visioning sessions. I went to the city engineer and I said, I think you could use a sidewalk here. You know what he said? Why would you say that, Chuck? We have to get out on the street. We have to put on our tennis shoes. We got to go out and walk. We got to meet people. We got to observe where they're struggling. And as cities, we have to orient ourselves not around how do we get the grant for the big project, but how do we deal with the day-to-day struggles of the people in our communities. I approach all this from a financial standpoint, primarily, and I'm telling you, we have been so obsessed with getting the dollar out on the edge of the community that we are overlooking the incredibly high return investments. We literally just need to stop and pick up those pennies and nickels and dimes that are laying there in our neighborhoods, just waiting for us. Cities that focus on this are seeing huge high return investments. And I hope that everybody in this room understands that this is well within everybody's grasp. Thank you so much. Our website is strongtowns.org. We're in November now. Last month, we put out a book about transportation policy at the state and federal level called The World-Class Transportation System. It's only available on Kindle, but if you go on our website or go on Amazon, you can find this really easily. It's only a couple bucks. So we just trying to share this message. I also, about 1.5 years ago, put out this book called Thoughts on Building Strong Towns. It's a collection of some of the best stuff we've put on the blog. It's kind of a 101 on strong towns. I was able to shove about 6 of them in my suitcase. They're only $10 each. If you want one and you're one of the first 6 people up here, I will gladly give you one. Thank you so much for this invitation, and I'm really excited about the things that I've seen and heard going on here in Maine, and I'm excited about this whole conversation today. So thank you very much.